It's going live.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Robin Palmer. Robin is from Washington, D.C. He decided to become a math major after taking a number theory cryptography course, at which he discovered how social and supportive the one math community can be. His favorite math fact is the story of how Brower became a prominent mathematician, only to start a school of thought that claims that he never actually proved it. Outside of math, Robin is the captain of the Corona Senior Intramural baseball team. And next year, he will be working in Amsterdam on getting credit for on this new visa. Welcome, Robin.
Hi, I'm Robin, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about topological algorithms and models for solving some problems in concurrent programming. This all begins with episode 1, the programmer's menace. This menace that I'm talking about is something called a race condition, and it's a problem that programmers face when writing concurrent programs. Imagine that there's a student making calls in the alumni office asking donors for money. Each time they finish a call, they're asked to walk into the middle of the room and press a button, which adds 1 to a counter the alumni office keeps of the total number of calls made that day. Each time a call is completed, they hang up the phone and walk into the middle of the room, press this button, boom, 1 more call has been made. Now, imagine we have 10 students all sitting in this room making calls. If at one point, more than 1 student finishes the call at the same time, and they arrive to press the button at the same time, humans can deductively reason about what should happen. One of them will just think, I'll go second and let this other person press the button first. They won't try and press the button at the same time. But we're not actually dealing with students in this case. We're dealing with computer processes. And computer processes only know how to do exactly what you've told them to do. So imagine that now the computer processes are making these calls or doing some sort of task. At the end of the task, they have to press the button. But since these are computer processes, the way they press the button is by first reading the value stored in the counter, which is at this point 0, then adding 1 to it, and writing the value back as 1. This works no problem when you just have process 1. But now, let's throw process 2 into the mix. They arrive at this button at the same time. They read the value, both of them, as 1. They each add 1 to it, and write the value back as 2. But actually, we've now made 3 calls, 2 by process 1 and 1 by process 2. So the counter is incorrect. This is an example of a race condition, a situation in which you get inconsistent or incorrect results based on the order in which processes access some resources that they have shared. Now, programmers are pretty smart, and they've developed some tools to prevent these race conditions. And the easiest one is something called a lock. And the way that it works is pretty straightforward. If there's a resource that's shared among some processes, you put a lock on it. And so if you want to use that resource, first you have to get the lock. While you have the lock, you can use the resource for whatever you like. But other processes have to wait their turn. Once you release the lock, then the next process in line can get the lock and use the resource themselves. These are designed to prevent race conditions. So let's put it back in the example we were just looking at and see what happens. Now, the first increment happens just as it did before, totally fine since there's just 1 process. But now when we introduce process 2, we also lock this resource. So when process 1 arrives, perhaps a fraction of a second before process 2, it immediately locks the resource and says no one else besides me can access this. Now, during the period in which process 1 is working on it, that is adding 1 and writing it back, process 2 has to wait. The resource is locked. So by the time process 2 gets access to this resource, the correct value is stored. It then reads 2, adds 1, writes it back, 3. Great, we've now mitigated that race condition. We're going to see, though, that these locks are going to introduce some of their own problems. But first, let's add a bit more formality. We have these 2 processes, T1 and T2 we'll call them. And let's make this resource a bit more generic. Just call it A. It's shared between T1 and T2, and it's locked. We can see the needs, we'll call them, of each of these processes. And in this case, they're the same. Each one of them needs to do some stuff, get A, do some stuff with A, and then release A and do some more stuff. And in one dimension, that models what happens when there's only one process happening at a time. But we can actually model what happens with n processes in n dimensions. So let's just start with 2. Here, we have T1 on the x-axis and T2 on the y-axis. And you'll notice that we have this gray square in the middle of the space. PA on each axis denotes the taking of the lock A. Now, at that point, T1 would have A. And VA denotes releasing it. You can think of it as picking it up and vacating it, if that helps you with the notation. So then, this gray square gives the region of the space where each process has the lock on the resource at the same time, something that's disallowed. We call that the forbidden region. Now, what we can do is we can model the possible execution patterns of this program through the space. What I mean by an execution pattern is these two processes are running at the same time. What are the different ways that they could both get A and complete? So we can look at them as paths through the space. In blue, we see the situation where T1 goes first. It skirts along the x-axis, passing PA, going to VA, and then mostly going up as T2 executes. The opposite case is shown in orange, where T2 goes first. And you may notice that these are what we call die paths, or directed paths. And all that means is that they're only permitted to move in what is deemed to be the positive direction in that space. Here, in R2, we can move positively in the x direction to the right, and positively in the y direction up. These die paths would never be permitted to move left or down. Let's look at a slightly more interesting example. Here we have two processes once again called T1 and T2. But now we have a second resource, B. And not only that, T1 and T2 now have different needs, even in their one-dimensional cases. T1 needs to lock A for a long time, that purple bar, while it needs to lock B for a shorter time in the middle of the time that it has A. T2, on the other hand, needs B for a longer time, and A only for a short time in the middle. So let's once again put T1 on the x-axis and T2 on the y-axis. You can see this more interesting forbidden region. In green, we have the area where both of the processes have a lock on resource B. In purple, we have the area where both of them have a lock on resource A. But we don't actually care why the forbidden region is built. We only care that it is the way that it is. So we're just going to make it gray. And so now we can once again look at these execution patterns moving through the space as directed paths. In blue, we again have the case where T1 goes first with both resources. In orange, again the case where T2 goes first. But now this more interesting forbidden region yields a third type of path. This red path goes into the lower left-hand cutout of the space. And since it's a directed path, once it gets in there, it actually can never get out. It would need to go left or down in order to escape that region. And this models something we call deadlock. And it's a problem introduced by locks in concurrent programming. We say that a program is in deadlock when two or more processes are waiting for a resource that they need, but that another process has. They're all waiting for something that's never going to come. And then they're just hanging. Basically, the only thing a programmer can do is shut the whole thing down and try again. And this is what that third path is modeling. So let's look back at these paths. We have these three paths, and if I gave you a worksheet of spaces with forbidden regions, I bet that most of you could draw many of the interesting paths going through them. But we're not talking about two-dimensional space. As I mentioned, we'll many times be doing this with lots of processes. And let me tell you, I don't reason very well in 50 or 100-dimensional space. No human does. So the next step of being able to talk intelligently about these spaces is to talk about some regions of the space. And that's episode 2, Attack of the Regions. The first region we have is the forbidden region, and we've already seen it. It's gray, and it's a space where the rules of our locks have been broken. You can't go in there if you're a path. The next region is the unreachable region. You'll see it in blue. The reason it's called that is because you can't reach it based on the rules of directed paths. No matter what happens, in order to get into that upper right cutout, you would need to go left or down. The next region, we've also talked about a little bit, is the doomed region in red. Once you get into this cutout, you'll never be able to escape because you have to go left or down. Finally, we have this orange square. And this is the most interesting region of the space. At least it's the subject of today's talk. And this region is called the unsafe region. It's called that because you may not be in trouble yet, but if you're not careful, you'll end up in the doomed region, which we know is bad. So you can see these three regions on the space: unsafe in orange, doomed in red, unreachable in blue, and of course the forbidden region. Now, episode 3, Revenge of the Computers. The ultimate goal of this talk is to build up an algorithm for computing the unsafe region. But for any algorithm that you might have, you're going to need to give your computer a good input so it can actually compute something meaningful. And we need to give our computer a way of having knowledge about what our space is. And that's what a cover is. We're going to use covers as our inputs for algorithms. A cover, in this case, a subset of R2, is going to be a finite collection of rectangles whose union is the entire space. So put all together, these rectangles cover the space. Here's a cover for the first space we saw today. This is also a cover. So is this. There are infinitely many covers, but there's one cover in particular that I care about. It's called the normal cover. We say that we have the normal cover for a space when they have all of the maximal rectangles of the space, no more and no less. What's maximal rectangle? Let's try and deduce that based on what these rectangles look like. If you look at the red ones, you can see that they go all the way from the bottom to all the way at the top. And they also fill in the regions between the edges of the graph and the forbidden region. The same is true of the blue rectangles at the top and the bottom. More formally, a maximal rectangle is one that has no bigger rectangle that contains that rectangle. And you put all of these rectangles together, the maximal ones, you get your normal cover. And a great property of these normal covers is that any other rectangle you draw in the space will be fully contained by one of these maximal rectangles. So let's try and build your intuition of how these normal covers work. We have this space here. It's sort of two squares joined at the middle. What would be a good normal cover for this space? When I was first working with these covers, I would have told you that this was the normal cover for this space. And that kind of makes sense, right? It's two squares pushed together, so those two squares together would form the normal cover. But if you look at R3 and R4 now, you can check that R1 and R2 wouldn't be the normal cover because neither one of those latter two rectangles is fully contained in R1 or R2. So we include R3 and R4 to create the normal cover for this space. Now, let's look at a normal cover for a space we've worked with already. The Swiss flag region, as we were working with before, has three types of rectangles in its normal cover. The orange squares, which fill in the regions of the cutouts, the pink vertical rectangles, which are on either side, and the green horizontal rectangles on the top and on the bottom. Together, this is the normal cover of the Swiss flag space. Now take a second to look at it. You'll see that all of these rectangles are sort of maximal in the sense that they're filling out all the space that they possibly could. Additionally, if you try and put some rectangles in there, I hope you'll agree that any rectangle you might draw would indeed be fully contained by one of these maximal rectangles. Now, episode 4, a new relation. We have this relation, and it's a relation on rectangles. It's a partial order. We say that R is in the past of S, and we denote it with this curly less than. But what does it mean? Let's look at these three rectangles, R1, R2, and R3. We say R1 is in the past of R2 if from any point in R1, you could draw a directed path getting into R2. I would also say that R2 is in the past of R3 because from any point in R2, you could draw a directed path into R3. So if, as my caption claims, R1 is in the past of R2 and R2 is in the past of R3, we should be able to draw a pretty cool directed path through the space. Wow, that is a really cool directed path. Now, let's look at some rectangles in space. We have this green rectangle and this orange rectangle. You say that the green rectangle is in the path of the orange rectangle because, as we've seen, from any point in the green rectangle, you can get into the orange. But if you move the orange rectangle to the other side of the forbidden region, you get two rectangles that are incomparable with respect to this relation. That's because if you start a path in the top of the orange square, you won't be able to get into the green rectangle using the directed path. On the other hand, if you start a directed path in the rightmost part of the green rectangle, you won't be able to get into the orange square. So those are incomparable. The last thing we want to talk about with respect to this relation is this downward closure operator. And the way that it works is you start with one rectangle, in this case, R1. We begin by adding in to our downward closure all rectangles that are in the past of R1. So in this case, that would be R2. Then we iterate on this process over and over again, adding in the rectangles that are in the past of our current group until we stop adding in new rectangles. Thus, we would get this region as the downward closure of R1. So, episode 5, the examples come back. This is the example we're going to work with for the rest of this talk. You can see how it's generated by each of the processes on the x and y axes. But just trust me that it's well generated and concern yourself with the way that the space looks. We're going to look at the normal cover first. You can see the 2 blue rectangles, the 2 orange ones, the 3 vertical green ones, and the pink one that's a bar across the top. We can also look at the regions of this space. In orange, we have the unsafe region. In red, we have the doomed region. And in blue, we have the unreachable region. Just note that the unsafe region also includes the doomed region. Now, episode 6, the return of the algorithm. I want to take a moment to pause and thank Dr. Lisbeth Fajstrup from Aalborg University in Denmark. She's the author of the seminal work in this field, and it's her algorithm that we're beginning with today. The first step of her algorithm, which is to compute the unsafe region of the space, is to remove all of the rectangles that we deem to be safe. Now, what does it mean to be safe? I say that you're a safe rectangle if you contain that upper right-hand point of the space, because that point means that you're fully done. You've completed. So if you contain that point, then you're a safe rectangle. So let's remove all of those rectangles. Now, we want to keep only the rectangles that have no future. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they're not fully in the past of any other rectangle. See, if you're in the past of a rectangle, then no matter where you start, you'll be able to get into that rectangle. But we're worried about places where you might get stuck. So if you're not in the past of any rectangle, then that means that there's some place that you could start that you wouldn't be able to get out. So let's only keep those rectangles. In this case, just this blue square. The last step of the algorithm is to take the downward closure of this blue square, or your group of rectangles that have no future. And so let's look back at the normal cover. But if you look at it for a second, you'll see that there aren't any rectangles that are in the past of the blue square. So the downward closure of the blue square is just the blue square. But that's actually not right. We know that the unsafe region is this whole area, including the bottom left-hand rectangle. We reached out to Professor Fajstrup, and she agreed. We found an error in her algorithm. So we set out to fix it. Episode 7, the student awakening. We decided that the way we wanted to fix this algorithm would be to add some more rectangles in, so that when we took the downward closure, the rectangles would be there in the path of the one left square. So how would we add those rectangles in? Essentially, we want to add the rectangles by allowing the existing rectangles in the normal cover to cut each other up where they overlap. We don't really have time to go into exactly how this works, but I'll show you where we introduce every new rectangle. Then we're just going to execute the algorithm as we did before. So let's try it. We have this normal cover, but now we're going to let some of these rectangles be reintroduced as slightly smaller versions of themselves. You can see the 4 newly added rectangles in red. Now we remove all of the safe rectangles, keep only the rectangles that have no future, and take the downward closure of the blue square. But now we have these 2 rectangles that are in the path of the blue square. So when we take the downward closure, we're left with this orange region. And that's correct. So we're happy. Now, episode 8, the last slide. Thanks so much for listening, and thank you, Professor De Silva, who's been an invaluable mentor. I'd really like to thank all of my peers who've supported me. I'd love to take any questions, but make sure you look out for episode 9 coming sometime next week. Yeah, so the unsafe region of the space is the space where you're still vulnerable to enter into deadlock. So being able to compute that region allows a programmer to know where in the program they might need to be especially careful. This is really pure math, the algorithms talked about here are really computationally intensive, so it's not like anyone's using this very much, but it is interesting.
You want your algorithm not to ever go in here?
Well, you wouldn't be able to, right? If you start at the bottom left-hand corner, you would never be able to like not start in the unsafe region. But what you might do would be you would choose to go immediately up as opposed to going to the right, because then we would escape the possibility of deadlock. Yeah, Chris.
When you say that a rectangle is in the past of the other, do they physically have to overlap, or can there be like a disjoint?
Yeah, so this is a slight simplification. There's actually a direct relation called immediately in the past where they have to overlap, but then there's the transitive closure of that where if you're in the past of a rectangle, it's in the past of a rectangle, then you're still in the past of that. Yeah.
So I was wondering about the new algorithm. So it definitely does seem to do better than the old one in some cases. Are there any cases you're aware in which it doesn't work, or does it seem to be like close to 100%?
We're proving that it's correct right now. I think that we have the correct outline, but we haven't fully pieced it together, so there's still the possibility that we'll find some problems.
Sure. So how do you build the forbidden region from a program? The programs you've given are short, straight line programs, but what if they're branching or somehow data dependent?
Yeah, sorry. No, so that's a little bit glib. The answer is that like there are ways that you can turn more complicated programs into these simpler programs. But in some cases, like the ones that you mentioned, you actually get into big problems. If you have potentially non-terminating looping, then you're never going to be able to do this because you'll never be able to put it on an axis. So like right now, as I said, like this is mostly a thought experiment. And so like the work that we're doing here wouldn't actually be very applicable to someone actually trying to avoid deadlock. Yeah.
So if you were able to calculate the unsafe region, and then when you're in the unsafe region, as you said, like be careful and try not to go into that blue region, then what's stopping you from just drawing a feasible path in the first place?
Right. I think that the reason you wouldn't be able to do that is because like computing paths in highly dimensional space is much more difficult than doing these relatively simple comparisons between rectangles. So the idea is that you create a bunch of iterative processes that are relatively not that complex, such as generating the cover, then doing these comparisons and slimming down the cover into these spaces, whereas actually trying to draw a path through high dimensional space is very computationally expensive. Yeah.
Does the algorithm that computes unsafe regions use more than one process?
It could if you wanted to go a little bit faster. But then you'd get into some like weird things where you'd be like trying to compute the unsafe region or something that was trying to compute the unsafe region. Then it just gets really confusing, you know?
I mean, all you have to do is use your own unsafe algorithm to prove that your own algorithm is unsafe.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
The mouse was in the middle of the screen.
I'm Grant. I'm here to introduce Adam Starr, who's going to talk about fair voting. Adam Starr is from Missouri. When he's not doing math, he's on making, discussing, and or being hard. Going to pursue ranks here at the moment, focusing on issues such as mail and access and alcohol policy and diverse topics. Next year, we'll be working on cybersecurity. And the fun fact is that if you were to be reincarnated, you choose to be a sea spy. So that's that ocean work for.
Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be talking about how to have a fair voting system. Whenever we talk about voting, there's a couple of populations we want to concern ourselves with. The first of those is the voters. We'll call those V. We want this to be a non-empty, finite collection of people. So we'll call them Wendy, Victor, Wendy, Xavier, Yael, and Zoe. Another population we concern ourselves with are the candidates. We'll call these C for candidates. And this, again, will be non-empty and finite. I've been consistently disappointed by the people candidates, so let's go with pizza topping. Anchovy, bacon, and cheese. When discussing them in the talk, I'll use sepia to denote anchovy, wild strawberry for bacon, and goldenrod for cheese. So we want a way to have a decision based on the preferences of the voters to rank the candidates. So we rank. So the information we have is called the state of the voters. This is a function which takes voters to orderings of candidates. So when we discuss this, we will use the notation that S of V of A is greater than S of V of B, to mean that in state S, voter V prefers candidate A to candidate B. If we want to refer to the collection of all possible states, we will use this product notation. So what does the state look like? Well, perhaps Victor prefers cheese to bacon to anchovy. Wendy prefers bacon to cheese to anchovy. Everyone has their own ordering of the pizza topping. This is our state. But we need a way to go from this information to one ordering which we can make a decision from. This is what we call the voting decision function. This is a function from a state to an ordering of the candidates. You can think of it as squishing it down. We will use the Greek letter C to denote this function. We use similar notation as well. C of S of A greater than C of S of B means that in state S, voting decision function C prefers candidate A. So we can take a look at what this is. If we have a given state, we can collapse it down to some order. Now, right now, C is kind of a black box. We don't know what it's doing. But we can put some constraints on it, try to figure out what we need it to be in order to have a fair system. One constraint we'd like is unanimity. If every voter prefers candidate A to candidate B, then our voting decision function should as well. So in state S, we can see that all voters prefer bacon to anchovy. So our voting decision function also prefers bacon to anchovy. However, cheese is not unanimously preferred to anything, so we don't know where it ends up. Perhaps it ends up in the middle. Another constraint on fairness we would like is called the irrelevance of third alternatives. This says how you think about candidate C should not influence your relative ranking of candidate A to candidate. It might be a little hard to grasp at first, so I like to illustrate it with a story that shows you how it's a little absurd if you don't have the irrelevance of third alternatives. This is attributed to the philosopher Sidney Morgenmuster, who went to a cafe and ordered a slice of pie. The waiter said, "We have pumpkin and pecan." The philosopher said, "I'll take pumpkin." The waiter said, "I forgot, we also have apple." So Sidney goes, "Well, in that case, I'll take pecan." So what does this look like in our case? Well, if we have some state S, and then some voting decision where cheese is preferred to bacon, and some new ordering where now anchovies is mixed around, we should still prefer cheese to bacon with anchovies somewhere. Another constraint we want is monotonicity. You can think of this as if you're going to win an election and more people vote for you, you should still win the election. So if you have two states, state S and S prime, and C of S of A is preferred to C of S of B, then in state S prime, you have more voters, including the ones from S, who prefer A to B, then this new voting decision should also prefer A. So we have some state S, which leads to this outcome. And then we have anchovies preferred to cheese in this case. And we have more people who now prefer anchovies to cheese. We should, in our new decision, prefer anchovies to cheese. So what does this look like? Let's illustrate this with an example of Victor, Wendy, and Xavier trying to order a pizza. They decide you should pick between anchovy and bacon pizza. Let's rank our favorites and go with majority rule. In this case, it's a pretty simple decision in favor of anchovies.
But Wendy's a little disappointed. She really doesn't like anchovies and thinks that if they add cheese as an option, there might be a more favorable decision. So they re-rank, this time with cheese as an option. They have a dilemma. There's a tie on every level. There is no way to make a decision. So they were thinking, what can we do? They couldn't add one more person because that could just lead to a two-way tie. So what if they invite their two other friends, Yael and Zoe? And they have their own rankings and they can make a decision based on majority rule, going on the first line and then the second. They end up preferring bacon to anchovies. But then Zoe goes, well, I'm not so sure about my decision. Maybe I actually prefer cheese to bacon. And they recalculate and they find out that now anchovies is preferred to cheese, preferred to bacon, which is a violation of the irrelevance of third alternatives. So this obviously was not a good voting decision function. So they go, all right, let's come up with a new idea. And so Zoe has an idea. How about whatever Zoe wants, the group gets? Zoe likes this. But does it meet the group's criteria for fairness? Well, if everyone wants something, then Zoe also wants it. So we're good with unanimity. If Zoe wants something, the group gets it, and they switch around the group's results, and it doesn't affect Zoe's outcomes. And if Zoe mixes things up, only the ones that she mixes up are affected. We have irrelevance in third alternatives. And if Zoe wants something and more people join her in wanting that, we have monotonicity. So it meets all of our criteria for fairness. The group's not so happy that the decision function's just Zoe. And they decide, let's add one more criteria for fairness, and that is no dictators. There should not be someone like Zoe who solely determines the outcome of the election. So with majority voting, if you win half the population, you win the election. With the Zoe function, if you win Zoe, you win the election. In both of these, you have this concept of a forcing coalition. A group that if you win this coalition, if everyone in the coalition votes for you, you win the election. So we can reframe our no dictators rule as there should be no forcing coalitions consisting of one vote. No single person should determine the outcome. So these are our criteria for fairness in our elections. But how can we come up with a way to model these elections, hopefully in a mathematical way? We use the notation of filters. A filter is a concept of sort of a large set of a power set. So I might use large and in the filter interchangeably, or small or not in the filter. So we want the empty set to not be in the filter, but the whole set to be. The empty set is small, the whole set is big. If S is in the filter and T contains S, then T should be in the filter. You are big if you contain a big set. And finally, if S and T are both in the filter, then their intersection should also be in the filter. You can think of this as being so big that the intersection of two big things is big. There's some particular types of filters we are interested in. The first type is principal filters. These are filters defined by a single element. You are big if and only if you contain this element. If we consider the real numbers, perhaps we could have the 47 filter, where you are big if and only if you contain 47. It turns out that principal filters are maximal. You can't add any more elements. We call maximal filters ultra filters. Being maximal is equivalent to having the condition that for all subsets S, either S or S complement are in the filter. You can't have both, because then their intersection would be in there, but that's the empty set, which violates our first axiom. Now it turns out that every filter is contained in an ultra filter. It's not hard to show, but it requires Zorn's limit, which is equivalent to the axiom of choice and beyond the scope of this talk. So what does this look like? Let's throw in some numbers so we can call it the math talk. And then we have the power set of 1, 2, 3, 4. In blue, we have a filter. We can see that the empty set's not in there. The whole set is. It's closed under intersections and also under supersets. For those who are not familiar with this notation, the upward lines denote the superset. If we consider 2, 3, 4, we see that it is not in our filter, and neither is its complement 1. Therefore, our filter is not an ultrafilter. We have a couple of different ways we can expand it. We can either add 2, 3, 4, or we can add 1. Let's add 1. So here in red, we have the elements which we can add to our filter to create an ultrafilter. In the end, this is our ultrafilter. We can verify that it satisfies all of the axioms, and that if any element shown here, either it or its complement is highlighted. So why do I introduce this notation? It turns out that filters effectively describe forcing coalitions. Because the empty set is not a forcing coalition, but the whole set is, due to unanimity. If you can win the whole group, you win the election. If S is a forcing coalition, and T contains S, then T is a forcing coalition. Because if you win all of T, you win all of S, and winning all of S is enough to win the election. Therefore, winning T is as well. And finally, if S and T are both forcing coalitions, then their intersection is as well. This is equivalent to the irrelevance of third alternatives. It's not that hard, so I'll leave it as an exercise for you. What are the implications of this? Well, it turns out that every ultrafilter on a finite set is principal. Why is this? Well, if we suppose towards a contradiction that we have a finite set with a non-principal ultrafilter, then we can consider the smallest element of this ultrafilter, which must contain at least 2 elements, as it's not principal. So we can split it up into 2 proper subsets, which their union is the original element. However, a property of ultrafilters is that at least one of those constituent sets must be in the ultrafilter. This violates our hypothesis that we had the smallest element of the ultrafilter. Therefore, we could not have such an ultrafilter to begin with. So this gives us Arrow's impossibility theorem, which says that with 3 or more candidates, our 4 desirable voting properties cannot coexist. Because if we have the first 3 criteria, then we have a dictator, a forcing coalition of 1 person. Because we have a forcing coalition of everyone that is contained in an ultrafilter, and we have a finite number of voters, therefore, we have a dictator, a principal ultrafilter. So this was discovered by Kenneth Arrow, who studied mathematics undergrad, went to economics grad school, discovered this in grad school, published it as his dissertation. Went on to win a Nobel Memorial Prize, but that was for other work. So we have a dictator. There is a way out, though. There are non-principal ultrafilters on infinite sets. Let's find one. Consider the co-finite filter. This is on, for example, R, but it can be any infinite set. You are large if your complement is finite. So the whole set is large because its complement is empty. The empty set is not. If you are co-finite and you add elements, your complements get smaller. So your supersets are still co-finite. And the intersection of 2 co-finite sets, the complement of that is the union of the original complements, which is still finite. So this satisfies all of our axioms. And I claim that this extends to an ultrafilter, which is not principal. If it was principal, then there would be some dictator, some singleton set, which would be in the ultrafilter. However, any singleton set is not co-finite. Therefore, it can't be in our filter. Therefore, there's no dictator. So we can avoid dictators if we have infinitely many voters. Really that simple. Let's recap. Our voting decision function was arbitrary, but for 4 criteria of fairness. We wanted unanimity, irrelevance of third alternatives, monotonicity, and no dictators. With finitely many voters and 3 or more candidates, those cannot coexist. So what does that mean? That means Victor needs infinitely many friends to make a fair decision about his thesis. I'd like to thank Professor De Silva for advising my thesis, Professor Garcia for advising me these past 4 years, all the professors I've had in class, and Kathy for keeping the department running, and you all for listening. Thank you very much. Yeah, so like U.S. elections are not fair. So like how, like consider third-party candidates. How you feel about a majority party candidate might influence whether or not you rank the minority party number one. So consider the 2000 election. The fact that Nader was on the ballots influenced whether people voted for or not.
So I remember at the end of your 10-minute talk, you kind of wrapped up and said that your thesis wasn't actually about this, it was about continuum hypothesis.
Yeah, it is.
Do you care to take us in that direction?
So, for those who don't know, the continuum hypothesis is something that's not decidable in standard mathematics. So, in 1940, 43, I think 40, Kurt Gödel showed that it is consistent with our standard axioms of mathematics. And then in 1960, 63, one of them, Paul Cohen showed that it is independent, that the negation is also consistent with the standard axioms of mathematics. And the way that Cohen did that involves constructing a certain version of mathematics, and he does that using filters.
It seems like this model assumes that there is the ability to make relative rankings between each candidate, but I think in sort of the actual electoral system, that's something that's unrealistic for most voters to do. How does that model sort of correlate with reality in those cases?
Are you saying that voters should not be expected to have a ranking of their?
Well, so someone could rank like I will vote Democrat over Republican and Libertarian, but not making a relative ranking between those two candidates. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think that's partially a function of our voting system. We only rank number one on U.S. ballots, so you don't need to have 2 or 3. But U.S. elections are still covered by this because you can think of this as just eliminating the bar.
Where the speaker talked about voting system with, I think, fewer criteria, maybe 2 or 3 that you mentioned. But they said that with 2 candidates, there is, so the majority vote function is the fair one. Whereas with more candidates, it's unsolved. I don't know if you're aware of that, or if you've thought of like increasing or decreasing the number of criteria to make it more fair, or other variations of your voting.
I'm not familiar with exactly what you're referring to, but yes, with 2 candidates, majority rule does work. However, if we do scrap one of these axioms, then definitely, like if we just get rid of the no dictator policy, like we're fine. We will